Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be reviewing The Last Superstition, a refutation of the new atheism by Dr. Edward Feser. Dr. Feser is a professor of philosophy, and he writes this book to deploy what is known as scholastic metaphysics as a rebuttal or an answer to the new atheism movement. You may have heard some of the quote-unquote four horsemen of the new atheism. Names like Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, and Daniel Dennett. You may have heard some of their arguments, watched some of their lectures or debates, and maybe even read some of their books. They're kind of known for a jabby, punchy, sort of aggressive rhetoric, often aimed at religion and Christianity in particular. Dr. Feser takes this book as a chance to not only, number one, take their sass and their sort of fun argumentative style, he kind of flips it back on them from a Western scholastic point of view. And he also deploys these two juggernauts of Western thought, Aristotle and Aquinas. He deploys their tools in a scalpel-like precision against the arguments of the new atheists. So he says, all right, let's look beyond the verbal judo and the sound bites. Let's look at their arguments and let's understand whether or not they have merit. The book opens with Dr. Feser kind of reviewing some of the more ludicrous statements from the new atheist movement and kind of poking and prodding the reader into thinking about what their claims are to keep them fresh in our mind. He then goes back to the ancients. He wants to build up a framework or a sort of intro to Aristotelian logic and scholastic metaphysics. He starts at the ancients. He says, okay, let's look at the questions that Plato and Aristotle asked in their day. You know, Aristotle's known as the philosopher. He then jumps ahead to the medieval times, and he starts to look at the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas, who was a Catholic priest monk who really kind of harmonized and showed how the thought that was prevalent in Aristotle could be harmonized with Christian thinking as well. So Dr. Feser reviews some of these things: arguments for the existence of God, final causality, natural law, traditional morality. What are the arguments for this thought and these ideas that have persisted for almost 2,000 years? And in the case of Aristotle, even longer. At this point, the book fast forwards to the Enlightenment. You know, people tend to have probably a positive view of the Enlightenment, like we emerged from this primordial slime and now we have reason and rationality. Well, now that Dr. Feser has given us this sort of scholastic metaphysics, this framework from which we can use to analyze the universe and the world around us, he deploys it in a scalpel-like fashion on the main arguments of the Enlightenment era philosophers. He examines their arguments and says, do these have reason? And when we find errors in their reasoning, how those errors magnify and grow dramatically over the course of time. It's as if someone were to stand at the base of a large metal pole or a building and shake the bottom, right? The vibrations at the very bottom are almost imperceptible compared to those later on that are experienced at the top. It becomes readily apparent that if Enlightenment era philosophers they have small errors in their reasoning that have large ramifications, modern and contemporary philosophers have massive holes in their arguments. This is especially the case in the four horsemen of the new atheism. I must confess I have somewhat of a soft spot for Christopher Hitchens. In my agnostic and loosely deistic phase of life, I would turn on a Christopher Hitchens video from time to time. I thought his verbal judo was quite high level. You know, he had great sound bites where he really sounded like he was making a strong point. Unfortunately, after reading this book, it becomes clear with a new set of eyes, right? You have some glasses on, these scholastic eyes you can put on, and really re-examine some of the arguments that they make. And unfortunately, I just don't think they stand up. They take a very cursory look at the arguments of Aristotle and Aquinas, and oftentimes they completely misunderstand their terminology. When someone like Thomas Aquinas uses, the supreme intelligence or the unmoved mover or final causation, These terms have very specific meanings. And if you don't read into them the thought and the thinking of an Aquinas or an Aristotle, you're going to come to very wrong conclusions. You're going to basically be attacking straw men. And unfortunately, I think that's actually what the new atheist movement is doing. It's missing the mark, really, because it's misunderstanding scholastic thought. One of the false dilemmas, I think, that our modern age thrusts upon us is this idea like, well, you either need to choose faith or you need to choose science. Can't have both. And, I just think it's a false dilemma, especially with a framework like this. I'm coming from a Catholic perspective. So, the creator of the Big Bang Theory, for instance, right? It was a Catholic priest. You can be a person of deep faith, and you can also subscribe to science and the scientific method to understand the world around us. There's no problems with that, in fact, and it should be encouraged. Now, there's problems that emerge, and Dr. Feser helps us to key in on those. Where are the shortcomings of the scientific method? And, because a lot of people don't even believe there are any, right? They think sort of science has sort of, especially the way someone like a Richard Dawkins talks, he talks as if evolution answers all the questions of existence, how we got here, where we're going, why the universe exists at all. And these are not questions for the realm of the scientific method. These go to philosophy. And whether or not there is a God or there must be a God, right? Some of these questions do have answers, and they're not just blind faith. Reason, and we have minds. We're supposed to use them to think. And if we do, you might be surprised at the conclusions you may get to. So what are some of these conundrums or dilemmas in science, right? It's a bold claim, right? Well, I would go to the body-mind connection. I would talk about consciousness. And Dr. Feser does in this book. He says, think about it. You can't find consciousness in the body. It's not like an organ, right? Sure, you can measure brain activity, right? You can put you in a machine and we can say, all right, this person's alive and they're conscious, but we can't define consciousness and what it is and how it emerged. And more specifically, what are the nature of these subjective experiences that we all feel, right? If you're sitting around a campfire and you feel the warmth, on one level you can explain it using science, the biology, what's going on, the chemistry. But there is certainly a subjective experience that you feel. When looking at a red wall versus a green wall, right? There's a different feel you get, and it may elicit emotions and feelings. And what about pain, right? You can explain the neurons firing that, when you stub your toe, what's going on. But there's a very real pain that you experience that's subjective to your person. And basically, these questions and this subjective experience are what science tries to rule out. It says, all right, let's not look at this stuff because it's going to impact our assessment of the world as it is. So it's as if the scientist has taken all of these subjective questions and swept them under the rug, and that rug is the mind, right? And then you ask the scientist, Mr. Scientist or Mrs. Scientist, how are you going to answer this question about all this dirt that's piling up under this rug? And they look at you and they say, we're going to use science. We're going to use the scientific method. By definition, it's a non-starter. This is the stuff that you ruled out in your deployment of this method. Therefore, by logical necessity, it can't answer these questions. And more to the fact, someone who subscribes to a scientific materialist worldview that only things that exist are that which I can measure and see, right? That I can use these utensils to really study. That's all that exists. An intellectually honest scientific materialist has to conclude that consciousness does not exist. Again, you cannot find it in the person. We know it has to do with the brain and the body being alive, but we can't point to it on a chart. There are, in fact, philosophers who are intellectually honest about this and will admit that consciousness may or may not even exist, right? I would say, I would go to something like Occam's razor and say that, that just doesn't make sense. That clashes with our common sense that we've been gifted with. And I think Aquinas and Aristotle would agree. If you even proposed some of these philosophical ideas of the contemporary age, they're just nonsensical. Even Richard Dawkins himself, when you separate the body and mind in this way, right, you create a sort of dualistic worldview where the body and the mind are completely distinct and consciousness is completely unrelated to the body. That's called dualism. Even Richard Dawkins himself, I've heard him say from his mouth that he's not a dualist, right? An evolutionary biologist, he's not a dualist. Incidentally, he agrees with the Catholic Church on this position. I'm not sure if he's aware of that fact, but I digress. I'd like to leave a link right now to this other podcast that I think does a phenomenal job of explaining Aquinas' 5 ways or 5 proofs for the existence of God. I think it's an easy and a great listen. If you're interested in Thomism, in scholastic metaphysics, check this out. I think it'll be worth your while. Again, this is The Last Superstition by Dr. Edward Feser. I would highly recommend this book, and I'll leave you with this following quote about the JFK assassination. It only takes one sentence to make the argument that organized crime had Kennedy killed to get his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, off its back. But it takes a great many pages to demonstrate the invalidity of that charge. Thank you for listening, and please stay tuned for more. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you.